people dislike me because I am not completely like them. I am trying to do with my life something which few people try to do. And this influences my thinking and consequently my actions.
And in what way are you different?
I'm supposed to not be mentally well.
A young man with catatonic schizophrenia was interviewed by a psychiatrist. Let's look at what happened. Catatonia is a relatively rare but distressing condition which can affect those with psychiatric illness. It is a complex combination of psychomotor abnormalities, disorders of thought and mood, and psychotic symptoms. Figures vary dependent upon the study, but roughly 25% of those with catatonia have schizophrenia, and half have mood disorders or medical illnesses. There are a multitude of different signs and symptoms. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5, DSM-5, requires several of the following symptoms for a diagnosis of catatonia to be made: absence of fidgeting, completely absent or greatly reduced incidence of fidgeting behaviors, catalepsy, a fixity of posture in opposition to gravity, posturing, spontaneous and active holding of a posture against gravity, waxy flexibility, a slight even resistance to positioning, stupor, absence of movement with a lack of reactivity to the environment, mitgehen, from the German to go along with, a facilitatory paratonia where individuals involuntarily assist passive movement, gegenhalten, from the German to resist, an oppositional paratonia where individuals involuntarily resist passive movement, agitation, agitation irrespective of the presence of external stimuli, mutism, no or limited verbal responses in the absence of established aphasia. Aphasia is an inability to speak due to a medical illness. Negativism, a lack of response to external stimuli. Mannerisms, odd caricatures of normal actions. Stereotypies, repetitive, abnormally frequent, non-goal-directed movements. Grimacing, facial grimacing. Verbigeration, obsessive repetition of meaningless words or phrases. Perseveration, the repetition of a particular response, whether that be a phrase or movement, irrespective of whether the stimulus is present or absent. Echolalia, the mimicking of another person's speech. Echopraxia, the mimicking of another person's movements. Automatic obedience to spoken or written instructions. If catatonia is suspected, then a therapeutic challenge with benzodiazepines is warranted. In individuals with catatonia, giving a fast-acting benzodiazepine like lorazepam can result in significant reduction in symptoms within 15 minutes, although sometimes significantly longer will be required for any effect. This is known as the lorazepam challenge test. If the person doesn't have catatonia, then their symptoms shouldn't resolve when given lorazepam. It is also important to rule out other illnesses which can present similarly, such as neuroleptic malignant syndrome, serotonin syndrome, locked-in syndrome, non-convulsive status epilepticus, stroke, encephalitis, delirium, and elective mutism. This recording was made in 1961 by the Department of Psychiatry in the University of California. It features a young man identified only as patient 18 being interviewed by one of the staff psychiatrists. He suffers from catatonic schizophrenia. Let's meet him now.
How are you feeling?
Well,
How long have you been here?
3 months, May 17th.
And what brought you here?
That's difficult to answer.
Could you give me some idea?
Offhand, I can't.
Immediately, I notice his rigid, upright posture and his lack of fidgeting. He also has excessively long delays to his replies. These average about 4 seconds, and this is much longer than is normal.
Whose idea was it that you come here?
A psychiatrist.
And what happened that ended up with your being here in the hospital?
The psychiatrist decided that this was the situation for me.
Did he tell you why?
No, the psychiatrist did not.
Has anybody told you why?
No.
Have you any idea why?
Yes.
Patient 18 is clearly trying to engage with the psychiatrist. He is answering each question to the best of his ability, but I'm struck by the long pauses before he answers, potentially indicative of a slowing or poverty of his thoughts and the concrete, literal-mindedness of his answers. Instead of describing the course of events leading up to his admission to hospital, he simply answers that his psychiatrist decided he should come in. When asked if he has any idea why he was recommended for admission, he eventually states he has some idea, but whereas most people would then volunteer why they thought they were admitted, he just says yes and stops. Concrete thinking resulting in literally correct responses, but very little freely volunteered information, is common in individuals suffering from schizophrenia. It can sometimes feel like a game of 20 questions with a participant who has sworn to answer honestly, but only divulge information if you ask for it in precisely the right way, in excruciating detail. But it is important to remember that they're doing their best, that this is a facet of the illness, and you need to show patience and understanding.
And what is that?
I am not completely like other people.
What do you mean by that?
People dislike me because I am not completely like them.
And in what way are you different?
I am trying to do with my life something which few people try to do. And this influences my thinking and consequently my actions.
What is it you're trying to do with your life?
Play the piano for people.
I'm not clear.
The interviewer isn't the only one who isn't clear here. With the average person, I'd expect the answer to a question about what they're trying to do with their life that few others try to do, to be somewhat unusual, if not out and out extraordinary. But patient 18 just wants to play the piano for people. Whenever I get an answer like this that doesn't logically follow or make complete sense, I'm always interested in finding out the thinking behind it. Frequently, exploring this can uncover hallucinations and delusions.
How is it that playing the piano for people has eventually resulted in your being here in the hospital?
I sit differently when I play the piano, and when I'm away from the piano I occasionally look differently from other people, and this has caused dislike from people.
They dislike you because you sit differently at the piano?
Yes.
What way do you sit at the piano that people would dislike you?
I cannot describe an illustration of how I sit.
So, he sits at the piano in a way which makes people dislike him. Later, he states that the manner in which he stands when away from the piano also makes people dislike him. While I can imagine some scenarios in which people could sit or stand in such a lewd and offensive way that they'd cause upset to all and sundry, it is difficult to imagine this placid young man behaving in such a manner. I think it is safe to say that any offence he believes he causes exists only in his mind.
And I can't imagine it, that it would make people angry at you or at least dislike you. How do you know they dislike you?
My father does, and doctors do, because of the way I appear in relationship to the way I sit at the piano and occasionally stand when I am away from the piano because of the way I sit at the piano.
How do you stand when you're away from the piano that they dislike you?
I can't describe an illustration.
Does it feel to you any different from the way other people stand?
Yes, it feels different.
In what way?
This is becoming too involved to describe.
So, he believes that his father and doctors dislike him because of the way he sits at the piano and stands away from it. This is very unlikely to be true, although we have no specific evidence one way or the other within the video. More tellingly, he cannot provide any additional details about what the difference in his stance is. This vague inability to provide specific details when pressed about specific proofs underlying their beliefs is common in schizophrenic. I've lost count of the times a paranoid schizophrenic will describe a vast interlocking conspiracy involving hundreds of people across a dozen or more organizations and will promise to bring me in pictures, video, email, and texts which prove what they are saying is true, only to never actually bring anything in, or bring in a picture, video, email, or text which has nothing to do with what they've alleged.
Would I be right in assuming then that you don't feel that you belong in the hospital, but that other people did feel that?
As soon as I express the belief that I do not belong in this hospital, which is a mental hospital, then those who dislike me want to find a worse place for me.
I'm not sure I understand. Could you make that clearer for me?
No.
Is this a way of...
Yes, I can. As soon as I express the belief that I do not belong in this mental hospital, then those who dislike me want to find a hospital where the living conditions are not as good as this.
Again, we have the pattern of a likely delusional statement being made, more specific information being sought, and patient 18 being unable to provide it. He tries, but really only restates his previous answer about people wanting to find a worse place for him to stay if he expresses the belief he shouldn't be in hospital. This isn't perseveration, the repetition of words and phrases without purpose, but it is quite common in schizophrenics. Frequently, they seem unable to elaborate cogently on whatever thought or belief they have, and when asked to clarify, merely restate it again and again and again.
But why are you in the hospital in the first place? I'm not clear.
Because I'm working to do something which, in my life, which most people do not do. This influences my thinking and occasionally my actions. And a psychiatrist has noticed this.
What has he noticed?
Likes the actions and the thinking, and has decided that I should be here to change them.
What actions?
How I talk and how I look right at this moment.
And how would you describe the way you're talking and looking right at this moment?
As other people talk, and at this moment, however, I've been told that it is not the way other people talk and look.
Have you any idea in what way it's not like others?
No, because I believe it is as other people talk.
There's a lack of insight into how his thoughts and presentation differ from others. This lack of insight is very common in schizophrenia. Patient 18 recognizes that others feel he thinks and presents differently, but he doesn't see it, apart from his probably delusional belief that he sits at the piano and sometimes stands differently.
So then, from your point of view, not from other people's point of view, from your point of view, you look, you talk, you think, you behave as other people do. You're very interested in learning to play the piano. You sit at the piano a little differently from the way someone else might, and you stand somewhat differently.
Occasionally I stand differently.
Now that in itself doesn't seem on the surface to be sufficient reason for being in a hospital. So what other reasons have been given to you, or what other reasons do you understand are the causes of your being here?
I'm supposed to not be mentally well.
I'm supposed to not be mentally well. It is clear from this statement that patient 18 doesn't believe he is mentally unwell, a clear sign he lacks insight into his illness.
Oh, and what's supposed to be wrong with you?
No doctor has told me.
It's hard to believe.
I tell the truth.
This also occurs frequently with inpatients who are psychotic. On many occasions, I've had a patient tell me no one has ever explained their illness to them or given them their diagnosis, when I know I discussed both these issues with them the day before, or even earlier that same day. Often, even when told their diagnosis, patients with schizophrenia will reject it and argue that either something else is wrong or that the doctor treating them is part of the conspiracy against them.
What are your plans? If things should go well, if you were to leave the hospital, then what?
I need financial help from my father to prepare me for obtaining a job as a piano instructor at a university where I will be able to teach people how to play the piano and also play the piano for people.
Have you had the training yet to permit you to be an instructor?
No, I have not.
So, he wants to become a piano instructor at a university, but hasn't had the training to become a piano instructor at all yet. His goal appears quite unrealistic given his illness, but we must remember that he has no insight into the fact he is ill, and therefore doesn't realize how unrealistic his goal is. Again, this is very common in schizophrenia. I've had paranoid schizophrenics who refuse treatment, who want to become law enforcement officers, or cybersecurity experts, pilots, or mental health professionals, and who don't have any insight into the unique challenges their illness would pose in those jobs.
Have you tried?
I don't understand what you mean by...
Have you tried to get the instruction?
Yes, I have tried.
What's happened?
I have not had the correct environment for the instruction, nor the correct financial help for the instruction, nor the correct instruction.
Have you been accepted for such instruction?
By some teachers, yes.
And by others, no?
Yes. Again, it has been about half and half.
Have you started any such instruction with those who did approve of it?
Yes.
And how has it gone?
With some it has gone well, with some it has not gone well.
That's sad to hear. Given the clear weight of his illness, I'm sure any piano instruction given patient 18 would have faced significant challenges. Challenges he didn't recognize and so couldn't account. So, as a psychiatrist looking at this video, what can I conclude? Firstly, patient 18 appears to have little insight into the fact that he is unwell. He has some persecutory beliefs about his father and the doctors. The interviewer didn't probe deeply enough to determine that these beliefs are of a delusional intensity, but it seems likely that they are. All of these symptoms point towards an underlying diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia. There are two major signs which point towards schizophrenia. Firstly, I am very struck by the long delays in patient 18's answers. In the course of a roughly 600-second interview, he has just over 200 seconds of pauses when trying to answer questions. That 33% of pauses is far in excess of what is normal, and is highly indicative of either or both poverty of thought and thought disorder, both of which are common in schizophrenia. Secondly, his eye movements. He appears to have quite unusual, jerky movements of the eye, and his gaze appears highly inconsistent. More specifically, he appears to have significant saccadic eye movement. Saccades are abrupt movements of the eye in either the horizontal or vertical plane, which are used to transition from focusing on one point to another. These are different than nystagmus, which is involuntary eye movements which occur when trying to focus on a single point. Additionally, his gaze just isn't directed as is normal. Both pathological saccades and direction of gaze issues are common in schizophrenia. In fact, it has been known for over 100 years that disorders of eye movement can be helpful in diagnosing schizophrenia, and, more recently, computerized eye tracking software has achieved very high rates of success in diagnosing schizophrenia just from analyzing eye movements. Some studies have achieved over 90% accuracy. So, the evidence of poverty of thought and thought disorder, what appear to be persecutory delusions, lack of insight, and two significant eye movement disorders all support a diagnosis of schizophrenia. In terms of catatonia, I feel that he sits abnormally still. He interacts briefly, and he has poor eye contact, decreased blinking, and disordered eye movement. This fulfills two criteria of the Bush-Francis Catatonia rating scale and justifies a diagnosis of catatonia. I invite you to click on the link to the Bush-Francis Catatonia rating scale in the description and check out the interactive rating scale there to see how psychiatrists assess for catatonia. So, overall, a diagnosis of catatonic schizophrenia is quite reasonable for patient 18. It should be noted that his catatonia is very minor indeed, and so the diagnosis is not as clear as it would be in more severe cases. I've seen a lot of commentary offered up online about patient 18's diagnosis and presentation. I think it would be useful to address some of this commentary and speculation. I wish to make it clear that any speculation is limited by the fact that we only have a short interview which doesn't really delve into the depth required for a rigorous diagnosis to be made, and that any opinions offered are my own, and while I have several decades of clinical experience, I'm not infallible. The main speculations and commentary I've seen are as follows. Firstly, that patient 18 was committed due to being homosexual and is highly sedated. Even in 1961 in America, it is unlikely he would have been committed against his will simply for being homosexual. Unfortunately, it isn't impossible, but seems unlikely. In terms of him being highly sedated, I think that is unlikely to be the reason for his behavior for a number of reasons. Firstly, sedation wouldn't impact his saccadic eye movements in the way we see in the video. Secondly, while his delay in answering could be due to sedation, there is no associated slurring of speech, slowness of pronunciation, or slouching of posture that would normally accompany significant sedation. His presentation is far more in keeping with catatonic schizophrenia than oversedation, in my opinion. Secondly, that he was autistic. While it is true that individuals with autism spectrum disorder have been shown to have disordered gaze, any saccadic issues tend not to be as markedly obvious to observers as in schizophrenics. I've worked in units specializing in treating individuals with autism spectrum disorder and treated hundreds of schizophrenics over the past 3 decades. The quality of his eye movements simply strikes me as far more in keeping with schizophrenia than autism. Obviously, that's a clinical judgment call and not incontrovertible evidence. In addition, his persecutory ideation is more in keeping with paranoid schizophrenia than autism spectrum disorder. I think that while it isn't absolutely certain, the balance of observable evidence is not in favor of an autism spectrum diagnosis. Thirdly, that his delay in answering questions and eye movements are indicative of him actively reacting to auditory hallucinations. It is possible, but I don't think that's the most likely explanation either. His eye movements are very clearly saccadic in nature. Saccadic eye movements are not temporally related to auditory hallucinations. The delay in answering questions is quite in keeping with poverty of thought and thought disorder, and so actively hallucinating is not required to explain this behavior either. Fourthly, that patient 18 is an actor, known as a standardized patient. While actors are often used to simulate patients in psychiatric teaching and examination, it is always considered better to have patients represent themselves whenever possible. I find it difficult to believe that an actor would be able to voluntarily create such an accurate representation of involuntary saccadic eye movements. The general quality of his presentation is of a real patient also. So I don't think patient 18 is an actor. If he is, then he is an extremely gifted one. It is most likely that patient 18 was a participant in a study on the consistency of psychiatrists' clinical judgments by Robert J. Stoller and Robert H. GEERTSMA from 1963. In their paper, they make it clear that they used real patients and filmed from the perspective of the interviewing psychiatrist, just as occurs in this video. Most importantly, though, it is necessary to state that the video was designed to demonstrate signs and symptoms of catatonic schizophrenia and not to differentiate between autism spectrum disorder or delve into his sexuality. Therefore, it simply doesn't contain the information necessary to conclusively answer these questions, and doubt will always. So, what happened to patient 18? I've found 2 stories on the internet which purport to explain who patient 18 was and what happened to him. The first story states that his name is Stephen E. He is 79 now and lives with his wife of 43 years in a peaceful setting. Here is what Stephen said. I had multiple arrests, 2 felonies, and hospitalizations on my road from crisis to regaining my independence and dignity. If I hadn't had a social worker, if I hadn't had a doctor, if I hadn't had medications, I would be homeless, I'd be in jail, or I'd be dead. But I'm well. This is what happens when you have the services, have a solution, and the medication does help me. Have someone to lead you to the place you need to be in order to move forward with your life. For me, it was my dad. Around 1969 or 70, I don't remember, I had a psychotic break, and my dad got tired of fighting with me. I ended up walking down the street naked at night. A police officer who was crisis intervention trained picked me up. He treated me with respect. I said, "Don't handcuff me. I haven't broken the law." He says, "Okay." He says, "What kind of music do you like?" And I said, "Rock and roll." And he turns the radio dial until he picks up the Beatles, Let It Be. I'll never forget that. I remember saying, "This is better than a taxi ride." And then I got a social worker who led me to a good psychiatrist who prescribed meds. Then I became well. I have a lovely wife, kids and grandkids, and one great-grandkid. I pay taxes, I have friends. This is a nice positive outcome. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit the objective reality of the video. Let It Be was released in May 1970, while this interview was released in 1961. Stephen E. also says that his psychotic break happened in 1969 or 1970. Again, this doesn't fit the timeline. There are several other aspects of the story which are highly unlikely, but the deal breaker is the timeline. The second story was posted by a YouTube commenter who reported that this man was my uncle. I'm not going to give any names, but for those of you who are concerned with how things turned out for him, not well. There's so much to address here. First, let me say that he was being treated in this video with meds. Without the medication, his mood ranged from complete delusion to catatonic. As for being gay, I don't think he had much of a sex drive at all, with or without meds. As for the idea that he was put there because he was gay by some unloving family, that's ridiculous. I don't have time to say all the things my family tried just to make his existence somewhat peaceful, just for his own sake. My family had a couple of openly homosexual and lesbians in it, even back in the 60s. And with the exception of my mother's father, no one gave a shit. My uncle suffered with meds and even more without. After 40-some-odd years, most of which he spent in institutions, he took his own life by way of drug overdose. By the way, the comment about the plot twist, he never had a piano, was funny because he didn't. His seeming obsession with piano came and went, as did obsessions with religion, especially the Catholic Church and government. As far as I know, he couldn't play a lick. He was very ill at his best, and a living shell at his worst. I hope that answers some questions because that's all I have to say on the matter. He's been gone since the late 80s, and I really hope that other members of my family don't see this video, mostly because of the comments from people that somehow think they understand him better than the people who suffered with him. One last thing. I think people thought that he was talking about sitting or standing effeminately or something. No, he was talking about sitting or standing motionless for hours. Usually, not even his facial expression would change, but when it did, it was usually related to something in his mind only. I really can't begin to tell you all how heartbreaking the whole thing was. He did seem intelligent, and with meds, he did remind me of a high-functioning guy with autism I once knew. Unfortunately, this story is much more in keeping with what likely happened. Rates of ending one's own existence are elevated in schizophrenia, and the way in which the poster spoke about his uncle's presentation over time has the ring of truth through my ears. Whatever happened to patient 18, I hope that he found some measure of peace in life and is at peace now. I hope you found my review of this psychiatric interview interesting. I've included a short list of references in the comments for those interested in reading about the issues in this interview. I've also included a short list of books that some might find interesting. These are affiliate links, so if you purchase through them, I will receive a small amount. I will use this to improve both the quantity and quality of content. Please leave any comments or questions in the comment section, and I'll do my best to answer them. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.